Room 302 was in complete turmoil that morning. Miss Letitia's history class was known for being a display of authority, where the strict teacher seemed to control every breath of her students. Her piercing gaze was a clear message. There was no room for mistakes or distractions. History is about facts, not opinions, she always repeated. Despite this, there was a group that somehow slipped past her severity. Mariana, Lucas, and Clara were the students who always seemed to receive the best praise and the rarest smiles. Pedro sat at the back of the classroom, as usual, with his backpack full of books and dreams bigger than that environment. He was a soft-spoken boy, but his essays vibrated with a passion that even he didn't know how to express in spoken words. Pedro, you have to speak more, said Julia, his friend and classmate, always cheerful. But he preferred silence. Until that day. Miss Eusenia. Letitia, as per usual, walked around the room with her ruler in hand, lightly tapping the desks of each student while asking questions about the previous lesson. Lucas, excellent analysis of the Industrial Revolution. Clara, your perspective on social reforms was brilliant. She approached Pedro, stopped, and with one eyebrow raised asked, Pedro, why does it always seem like you're unprepared? Your demeanor gives me the impression. How can I say? Of carelessness. The comment came with a casual tone, but the weight of those words plunged the room into a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. Pedro, who always looked down when called, raised his head this time. Confused. Teacher, I did the reading. I'm prepared. Oh, really? She retorted, looking at the classmates. I just find it curious how you always seem out of place. Maybe it's how you present yourself. It feels like you lack pride, you know? The insinuation hung in the air like a blade. Pedro felt his face burn, not just from embarrassment, but from the clarity of what she meant. Mariana let out a muffled laugh at the front of the room, while Julia immediately turned to Pedro, her eyes wide with disbelief. Teacher, that was a bit. Julia started, but was abruptly cut off. A bit what, Julia? We're here to talk about history, not sensitivity. If everyone understood that, we'd make more progress. Pedro sank deeper into his chair. His classmates cast glances ranging from pity to nervousness. No one dared to break the silence, except Rafael, an impulsive boy who raised his hesitant hand. Teacher, maybe Pedro just needs more time to. Yana. Rafael, this isn't about time. It's about posture. But thank you for your concern. Can we continue now? Pedro's eyes were fixed on a non-existent point on the desk. He wanted to disappear, evaporate. It was the first time Miss Letitia's comment had been so explicit. Before, they were small insinuations, things he thought he could, being exaggerations of his mind. You need to try harder. Pedro, you don't want to be like, well, you know. Or some people have to work twice as hard to achieve the same results. But now there were no doubts, and there was no turning back. The lesson continued, but the atmosphere was tense, with an electricity that no one could ignore. Her words reverberated in each student's mind. Some murmured among themselves, trying to hide, while others remained in a complicit silence. However, when the bell rang, the room emptied quickly, as if everyone wanted to escape that suffocating environment. Pedro, however, stayed behind. Julia waited for him at the door. Pedro, you're not going to let this slide, are you? I don't even know what to say, Julia. Maybe she's right. Right? Julia was indignant. Right? That was wrong. Pedro, you can't let her talk about you like that. He looked at his friend, a mix of sadness and resignation on his face. Before he could respond, a final glance at the empty classroom made him reflect. How far could words like that go? And why did no one ever question it? As he left the classroom, Pedro carried not just his backpack, but the weight of a decision he knew would change everything. The hallway was louder than usual. Whispers and furtive glances followed Pedro as he walked to his locker. Julia, by his side, gestured animatedly, but he barely heard her. Sí. Buena tarde. Letitia's words continued to echo in his mind, heavy as lead. He felt exposed, as if every student knew exactly what she meant and silently agreed. At break time, Julia insisted on gathering their small group of friends to talk about what had happened. They sat at a table in the corner of the cafeteria, away from the noise. Raphael, already irritated since the incident in class, was the first to break the silence. That wasn't normal, Pedro. We know that, Dee. Leticia is tough, but what she did was personal. It was prejudice. Pedro shrugged, trying to ignore the knot in his throat. Maybe I'm exaggerating? She always talks like that. It's just her way, isn't it? Julia slammed her hand on the table, drawing the attention of nearby students. No, Pedro. That's not her way. She humiliated you in front of everyone. And it's not the first time. Raphael nodded, but went further. I didn't want to say anything earlier, but did you know that Tiago, the guy who moved in last semester, left because of her? He was one of the best in class, but Leticia kept picking on him too. And you know why? He said he thought it was because of his skin color. The revelation hit like a bomb. Pedro stood frozen, staring at the juice on his tray. He had always suspected something was wrong, but hearing it was different. Julia continued, her voice softer. Pedro, this isn't about you exaggerating. It's about her thinking she can say whatever she wants and no one will question it. That night at home, Pedro tried to organize his thoughts. Sitting at the table with his notebook open, he repeatedly reviewed his teacher's comments. No matter how hard he tried to justify it, her words kept sounding wrong, cruel. He knew he needed to do something, but what? His mother noticed his restlessness. Are you all right, dear? You're very quiet today. He hesitated. Just had a tough day, Mom. She moved closer, placing her hand on his shoulder. If you need to talk, I'm here, okay? Pedro gave a timid smile but chose not to share. How could he explain something so complicated without appearing weak or problematic? His mother already worked so hard to ensure he had opportunities. He didn't want to add more weight to her shoulders. The next day at school, the whispers persisted. Mariana and Lucas, Leticia's favorite students, were especially animated, laughing together as they talked about what had happened. Pedro caught snippets of their conversation as he walked by. He looked so awkward. Did you see his face? Mariana said, laughing. She just said what everyone thinks, right? Lucas replied, indifferent. That was the last straw. During the next class, Pedro could barely concentrate. When Leticia entered the room, he felt his stomach churn. With every word she spoke, it felt like everyone was silently conspiring to maintain that stifling atmosphere of oppression. After class, Julia dragged him to the coordinator's office. We need to talk to someone who can do something. If you won't do it for yourself, do it for others. In front of the coordinator's desk, Mr. Faun. Augusto. Pedro felt the gravity of the situation. Julia spoke first, laying out what had happened. The coordinator listened, but his expression remained neutral. When Julia finished, he let out a weary sigh. I understand your concern, but Leticia is a very respected teacher. I'm sure she didn't mean anything offensive. It might have been a misunderstanding. Pedro tried to argue, but the coordinator raised his hand. We'll handle this internally. There's no need to create a bigger problem than necessary. As they left the office, Julia was furious. Internally? That means they won't do anything. Pedro, however, felt something different, a mix of anger and determination. For the first time, he realized he wasn't overreacting, and that silence wouldn't solve anything. He knew this fight would be difficult, but something inside him whispered it was necessary. Still, the question lingered in the air. How far was he willing to go to be heard? Pedro couldn't sleep that night. The coordinator's words echoed in his mind, laden with indifference. We'll handle this internally. Internally meant hiding, silencing, ignoring. He knew that. Outrage burned in his chest, and the school's complicit silence made him feel guilty for caring. The next day, even before the bell rang, Pedro was sitting in the schoolyard, the only place where he could organize his thoughts. It was there that Julia found him, bringing 2 cans of juice. She handed one to him but remained silent, waiting for him to speak first. They won't do anything, Julia. And it won't be different if I insist. He opened the can, staring at the ground. You don't have to fight alone, Julia replied firmly. But you also can't let this die. Pedro sighed. He knew she was right, but he still felt the weight of doubt. Then, almost like an epiphany, an idea emerged. If the school wouldn't do anything, he would find another way to be heard. That night, lying in bed, Pedro grabbed his phone. With trembling hands, he began typing a post. It wasn't something he usually did, but at that moment, he needed to express himself. He described the incident with Miss Callas, Letitia, the repeated insinuations, the evasive response from the coordinator. He ended the text with a question that felt as heavy as his own pain. Why is it so easy to ignore something so wrong? How long will people stay silent? He hesitated before publishing, but anger and determination overcame fear. With a tap on the post button, Pedro released his voice to the world, and the world responded. The next morning, Pedro's post had become the topic of the day. The number of likes and comments was rapidly increasing, many from former students of the school. Some shared similar stories of uncomfortable moments with Miss Letitia, while others offered unwavering support. This happened to me too, wrote a former student. Finally, someone spoke about it. Thank you, Pedro. Upon arriving at school, Pedro noticed the glances directed at him, but this time, he didn't feel small. On the contrary, there was a fire in his eyes that no one could extinguish. Mariana and Lucas, on the other hand, looked at him with disdain. He heard them whispering as he passed by. He just wants attention. I bet it didn't even happen like that, Mariana said in a venomous tone. Pedro ignored them. He wasn't fighting for them. The biggest explosion came during recess, when Rafael ran up to Pedro holding his phone. Dude, have you seen this? He showed a message from Letitia posted in a closed school group, which had clearly leaked. It read, Social media is a dangerous space where immature people twist facts to attack those who are just trying to do their job. It's sad to see this kind of behavior, but I'm not surprised coming from certain people. Nash. Pedro felt his stomach churn. It was as if she was shifting the blame onto him, trying to portray the incident as an unfair personal attack. He knew this would only fuel gossip and divisions among the students. But before he could react, Julia appeared, holding his arm. You're not alone. Let's find someone. That could really help. In the afternoon, Pedro received a message that changed everything. It was from Mr. Vicente, a retired teacher he barely knew, although he had heard of him. He was respected by all, known for his fight for equality both inside and outside the classroom. The message was simple. Pedro, I read your post. If you'd like to talk, I'll be at the Central Square today at 6 p.m. I want to hear your story. That night, Pedro went to the square. Mr. Vicente was sitting on a bench, with a welcoming look that immediately put Pedro at ease. He listened attentively as Pedro vented, without interrupting. When Pedro finished, the teacher paused before responding. I know how you feel. I've been in your shoes. When I started teaching, I was treated as inferior because of my skin color. That didn't change overnight. But you know what I've learned? Silence has never helped anyone. Pedro looked at him, soaking in every word. Mr. Vicente continued, The struggle isn't easy, but every step you take, no matter how small, makes a difference. You've already started something bigger than you realize. Now, the question is, what will you do next? The question lingered in the air. Pedro knew he needed time to find the answer, but at that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in days: hope. As he walked back home, a new decision was forming in his mind. He didn't know exactly how, but he knew he wouldn't stop. Things were just beginning. The meeting organized by the parents at the school library that Friday started timidly, with half a dozen chairs filled and low murmurs. But as time went on, more people entered. Some wore worried expressions, others, frustration. Pedro was there, sitting next to his mother, who held his hand tightly, conveying silent strength. Mrs. Rosa, Pedro's mother, was the first to speak. Her voice was calm but filled with indignation. What happened to my son is not an isolated case. This teacher used her position of power to belittle and demotivate students like Pedro. We cannot let this continue. A father from the back of the room, Mr. Ernesto, raised his hand. I understand your pain, Mrs. East. Rosa, but we're talking about a teacher with over 20 years of experience. Don't you think it could have been a misunderstanding? Before Rosa could respond, another mother, Mrs. Claudia, took the floor. My son Tiago suffered something similar with Mrs. Leticia last year. He has always been a dedicated student, but she treated him as if he were less capable just because he wasn't part of her favorite group. We eventually had to move him to another school because no one here wanted to listen to our complaints. Claudia's words shifted the atmosphere. Other parents began to share similar stories, creating a chorus of voices that echoed through the room. Pedro felt a lump in his throat as he realized he wasn't alone. His heart raced. Here's the translated text. To each account. But what caught his attention the most was Mr. Ernesto's silence. He seemed to be reflecting, perhaps reconsidering his initial position. Meanwhile, in the school corridors, Leticia withdrew into a shell of denial. She was aware of the parents' unrest and knew the situation had spiraled out of control, but instead of admitting any fault, she chose to double down on her defensive posture. In the teacher's lounge, she remarked to her closest colleagues, "This is all a circus created by an overly sensitive student and a mother seeking attention. I know what's best for my classroom, and I'm not going to let them intimidate me." However, as she spoke, some of the teachers remained silent. One of them, Miss Helena, who taught literature, decided to speak up after Letitia's comment. Sometimes, Leticia, it's important to reflect on the impact our words have on students. Maybe what you said came across differently than you intended. Don't you think it's worth hearing what they have to say? Miss Mayan, Leticia replied with a cold smile. I'm not going to bend to this fragile generation, Helena. The cutting reply made it clear that she was not willing to change. Back at the meeting, discussions reached a critical point. Mrs. Rosa stood up again, this time with a proposal. I know that speaking here isn't enough. We need action. The school is trying to sweep the problem under the rug, but we, as parents, have the power to demand a formal investigation. And if we're not heard, we'll take this outside. The parents agreed. A petition was organized that same night, and Pedro felt a mix of relief and nervousness. Seeing his mother lead the movement filled him with pride, but it also made him realize that this was escalating in a way he had never imagined. However, he couldn't foresee what was coming next. On Monday, when he arrived at school, Pedro noticed that something had changed. The hallways were filled with murmurs and furtive glances. Julia found him before the first class, holding her cell phone. Did you see this? Pedro took the device, seeing a message that had circulated among the students. An audio recording of Ms. Leticia complaining about the situation, calling Pedro problematic and insinuating that he was overreacting because he couldn't handle criticism. The audio had leaked and was spreading rapidly. This just proves what everyone already knows, said Rafael, who had joined them. Not only does she have no remorse, but she also wants to cast you as the culprit. Pedro felt a mix of anger and sadness, but before he could respond, a deep voice called him. Pedro, 1 minute. It was Mr. Augusto, the coordinator. Come with me. He led Pedro to the coordination room, where Ms. Leticia was already seated. Her expression was a mask of professionalism, but her eyes showed irritation. The coordinator began. Pedro, we asked you to come in to clarify a few points. Ms. Leticia is currently worried about how her post has affected her image and would like to resolve this amicably. Pedro looked at them, incredulous. It was as if what he felt didn't matter, as if everything was about protecting the teacher. Resolve? Pedro finally said, his voice calm but filled with firmness. Resolving means admitting that what she did was wrong. Resolving means she stops disrespecting students like me. This is far from resolved. Leticia opened her mouth to respond, but Pedro continued, his voice rising slightly. And it won't be resolved if all you do is protect the one who is in the wrong. Pedro stood up and left the room, leaving Mr. Augusto and Leticia in silence. He felt his heart racing, but something inside told him he was doing the right thing. As he returned to the room, a notification popped up on his phone. It was Mr. Vicente. Stay strong, Pedro. The truth cannot be silenced. The message was simple but enough to fuel his determination. He knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time, he was sure he wouldn't back down. The assembly called by the school took place in the auditorium, and the atmosphere was so thick it felt like it carried the weight of recent events. Students, parents, teachers, and school board members filled the space to capacity. On stage, a long table held the key players: Mr. Augusto, the principal, teacher Ms. Leticia, and other members of the administration. Pedro, sitting next to his mother in the audience, felt his stomach turn. Julia and Rafael were nearby, casting looks of support. When the principal began the meeting, the room fell into an expectant silence. We are here today to address concerns raised about the conduct of our esteemed teacher, Ms. Leticia. We believe this is a moment to clarify misunderstandings and restore trust in our school community. The speech was careful, almost superficial, as if the goal was to minimize the impact of everything that had occurred. But before they could continue, Miss Rosa stood up from the audience, her voice clear and firm, cutting through the atmosphere. We are not here to hear empty speeches, Mr. Augusto. We are here for answers. The principal hesitated but gestured for her to continue. Rosa wasted no time. My son was publicly humiliated in a classroom because of his appearance. He is not the first, and he probably wouldn't be the last if nothing is done. This assembly is about accountability, not about protecting reputations. The auditorium erupted in murmurs, and the tension escalated further. Ms. Leticia adjusted her glasses and took the microphone, wearing a facade of serenity. I regret that anyone felt offended by my words. My intention was never that. I have always dedicated myself to teaching with rigor, but I see that in this generation, it's easy to distort facts and turn discipline into oppression. The audience reacted with a mix of surprise and indignation. Pedro, however, felt a fire grow inside him. He looked at his mother, who discreetly nodded, encouraging him. He stood up, took a deep breath, and grabbed the microphone that was being passed among the attendees. It wasn't discipline, teacher. It was humiliation. And this didn't happen just to me. There are students, former students, and even parents who can confirm that your words hurt more than they taught. Ms. Leticia tried to intervene, but Pedro did not back down. For years, you hid behind authority and reputation to belittle those who don't fit your standards. I'm not the only one who went through this, but fortunately, now I have a voice. At that moment, Julia stood up from the audience. And so do I, she said, turning to the auditorium. I was there and heard everything. I know what Pedro is saying is true. What started as a spark became a flame. Other students began raising their hands, sharing similar experiences. A girl mentioned an episode where Ms. Leticia made fun of a classmate's accent. A former student, called to the stage, recounted how he was treated coldly for never being part of the teacher's favorite group. The most shocking revelation, however, came from an unexpected place. Lucas, one of the students who had always been favored by Ms. Leticia, stood up hesitantly and asked for the microphone. I've always been one of the teacher's favorites, but honestly, I knew this wasn't fair. I saw how she treated others, and it never seemed right. I think it's time to admit that we also messed up by staying silent. The auditorium was in shock. Even as Leticia seemed surprised, momentarily losing her composure. Lucas's testimony seemed to be the turning point. The students' voices could no longer be ignored. The pressure from the audience was so great that Mr. Augusto, reluctantly, announced a formal investigation into Ms. Letitia's conduct. She, visibly shaken, tried to defend herself again, but her voice now seemed small amidst the rising volume of the allegations. Pedro returned to his seat, exhausted but feeling a wave of relief. His mother squeezed his hand, smiling with pride. He knew that the battle was not yet won, but for the first time, he felt that the truth had found a space to emerge. As the meeting came to an end, questions began to linger in everyone's minds. How would the school handle the impact of these revelations? And, more importantly, what would come next for Pedro, and for all who dared to speak? The answer was yet to come. The corridor felt lighter the morning after the assembly. Although the conclusion was still far off, there was a sense of change in the air. Pedro walked with his head held high, something he hadn't done in a long time. Julia and Raphael found him near his locker, both with encouraging smiles. "You were amazing yesterday," said Julia. His heart full. He felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just a victim. He had become a voice for change. "Hey," she said, touching his shoulder. "The way you spoke. There was no ignoring it." "I guess they finally listened, right?" Raphael chimed in, crossing his arms. "But the work isn't over yet." Pedro knew Raphael was right. The school had promised an investigation, but he also understood how these matters could be handled to protect reputations. Still, something inside him told him that the impact of the assembly was irreversible. The following week, the school announced Letitia's temporary suspension. The decision was met with mixed reactions. Some parents and students defended her, claiming she was a victim of a spoiled generation. Others, however, acknowledged that her removal was necessary. Pedro didn't let the criticism affect him. He understood that the truth needed time to be accepted. During this period, Pedro was invited to share his story at a local event about equality and respect, organized by the City Hall. It was Mr. Vicente who suggested his name, saying, "Pedro, you are not just a victim. You are a symbol of courage. Other young people need to hear what you have to say." On the day of the event, Pedro was nervous, but when he stepped onto the stage and saw the attentive faces in the audience, he found his voice. He told his story sincerely, highlighting not only the incident with Letitia but also the importance of not remaining silent in the face of injustice. "For a long time, I thought my silence would protect me. But silence only protects those who are in the wrong. Speaking out wasn't easy, but it was necessary." Warm applause echoed through the auditorium. When he stepped down from the stage, he was approached by several young people who thanked him for his words. One of them, shy like Pedro used to be, said, "You inspired me. I don't think I would ever have the courage to do what you did." Pedro smiled. "Courage comes with time. But what's important is to take the first step." At school, the effects of his stance continued to unfold. The administration began implementing sensitivity training for teachers and opened anonymous channels for students to report inappropriate behavior. It was a start, but already more than Pedro had imagined possible when he decided to speak up. Letitia, for her part, requested a transfer to another school after the investigation concluded, confirming the patterns of discriminatory behavior mentioned by students and parents. Although she never publicly admitted her faults, her departure marked a new chapter for the school community. On the last day of the semester, Pedro found an envelope in his backpack. Inside was a letter signed anonymously. "Pedro, thank you for not giving up. You've changed more than you know. Your strength has given us strength. Never forget that." He held the letter for a moment, feeling a wave of gratitude. For the first time, he realized that his fight hadn't been just for him. It was for all those who, like him, had been silenced. As he left school that day, with his heart full, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just a victim. He had become a voice for change. Julia and Raphael by his side. Pedro looked at the horizon and felt something different. It was hope. A hope he had helped build himself.